few housekeeping things before we get on with the show tonight. You will hear from Wendy, then there will be a time at the end of the program for some audience questions. After Q&A, please allow Wendy to move to the signing counter, which is the glass display case you saw on your way into the store. You may line up there to say hello, get a signed copy of the book, and proceed through the checkout. Just a reminder that if you do buy a book here this evening, you are not only supporting our author, but also a locally owned independent bookstore, and we cannot thank you enough. A quick reminder, though, that if anybody needs a mask, I can grab one for you, but otherwise we will go on bio. Wendy Horwitz is the author of Milkweed and Honeycake, a memoir in ritual moments. Her essays have been published in the Philadelphia Inquirer, After Image, Neurology, and Humanities section, Jewish Literary Journal, Interpreted Times, and the McClatchy Tribune News Service, among others. Originally trained as a pediatric psychologist, she's lived in Philadelphia, where she teaches writing and health humanities. Please welcome Wendy.
Thanks, Sarah. First, I want to thank Megan and Quinn and all the staff. Thanks, Sarah, for arranging this event. I'm thrilled to be at an independent bookstore, my favorite place to speak about my book and also to shop for books. So I want to start with a story that's not in the book. In a pile of photos in my home office is a small, square snapshot from the early 1960s. For those of you familiar with those snapshots at the time, it's that inimitable Kodachrome color with the scalloped white border, and on the reverse, the date of printing on the back. I'm 5 years old, I'm wearing red corduroys, and I have a short roll haircut and bangs. I'm standing at the hearth in a brand new home. My mom is steadying my hand as I light the Hanukkah menorah, the candelabra. She is seated on the hearth. As always, she has a trim A-line skirt, an apron covering it, hair in a neat bun, and bright lipstick. You can tell even from the the color photo, which is faded. My baby brother is looking eagerly at the menorah, and my sisters are standing nearby in matching pleated plaid skirts and headbands. My dad is surely taking the photo, and you can practically smell the potato pancakes frying in the kitchen. It's a warm holiday scene and notable because the floor is bare. There's no wall-to-wall carpeting yet, which will go in later, and there's a pile of unopened cardboard boxes in the back. What's remarkable about the photo is not only that my parents dug out the menorah from under the crated detritus of life with 4 children, right? But that they chose to do this just 2 weeks after we moved. I checked the dates on this. And 2 weeks after we moved, which was on, our moving day was November 22nd, 1963, which is the date that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So my parents worked to provide a Hanukkah celebration with all its rituals, not because they were particularly religious, not because of any sense that one had to do this, right? But I suspect they wanted to provide some sense of normalcy after the big move, and for themselves after the cataclysmic events in Dallas. Moreover, I think they recognize that ritual provides a sense of meaning, of continuity, a sense of identity, of light and delight, even in the face of dark days and unfathomable events. My book, Milkweed and Honeycake, for those out there, chronicles similar moments, mostly from the second half of my life so far, and not only in extraordinary circumstances. I include established rituals like weddings, graduations, memorials, holidays, but even those familiar rituals I serve with a twist. Along the way, I've also stumbled on rituals that we might not at first recognize as such, either discovering them or creating them in the small moments, in the ordinary transitions and changes when we might yearn for a visceral sensory act to mark the time, to mark what's important, to remind us how to live, to connect us to community, and sometimes to give us a glimmer of the transcendent, perhaps even the sacred, no matter our religious beliefs. I like to dive right into the book as a way to talk about my experience, and I'm going to start with a section from chapter 2, which exemplifies some of these central ideas that I've been alluding to. This is called Yellow School Bus Moments. When my son turned 6, he rode the yellow school bus for the first time. We stood at the corner with other families. He was biting his lip with an expression of bravado mixed with worry. A new bright red backpack, big enough to grow into, drooped below the back pockets of his pants. And when another child spoke to him, he looked shyly at his brand new Blues Clues sneakers. I surreptitiously took slow, deep breaths and tried to quell the rush of adrenaline, the pounding of my heart. The bus made a wide arc around the corner, groaned to a halt, and the door opened with a squeal. After a lingering hug, my son clambered up the steep steps. I could see his little face pressed against the window, and I waved madly. The bus turned the corner, the light changed, and it was silent. The traffic stilled for a moment. I dabbed at my eyes, and my neighbor, who had 4 children, said, "I know," and put her arm around me. "It gets easier," she said. But easier isn't exactly what happened over time and circumstances. That morning, my feelings were more complicated than just anxiety or sadness, more than something to get used to. I go on then in this section of the chapter to talk about this distinction from beginning daycare with the kid, and this just kind of separation, individuation that psychologists talk about, and little anxiety. And I say, the school bus was different, for while I felt a similar sharp tug at my heart when he boarded the bus, I also simultaneously and unexpectedly experienced something else in equal measure. The bus stop was the first time I consciously felt this novel mix, though I suspected it happened in small ways during the previous 6 years. At the bus stop, my mix of feelings included the familiar yearning and some sadness, but added to this was an exquisite joy and pride in my child's little departure. That doesn't quite capture the feeling. It is joy and pride tinged with a tug of separation, but more than that. With each turn of the season, that feeling deepened and became more complex, and I came to think of these as the yellow school bus moments. My younger child, Chris, who uses they, them pronouns, was probably 9 years old when I first saw them fall from 35 feet in the air. Well, not fall exactly. Technically, it's called a drop in circus argot. Their limbs were wrapped in various ways in a piece of silk fabric at a circus class, and they didn't fall on the ground, but still they fell out of the air, bounced on the end of the silk, and hung suspended like Charlotte in her web. A mother next to me whispered, "Aren't you petrified when they do that?" But I wasn't petrified. Thrilled, amazed, but not scared. It was a yellow school bus moment, a sense that this child was doing something nearly yards away from me, but in a place where I could never accompany them. And they certainly didn't get it from me. I get dizzy on merry-go-rounds. I'm not kidding. This was their path, their passion. Perhaps the complex feelings in the yellow school bus moments come from this. Just as we start to get to know these little creatures, for they seem to have barely arrived, they start to leave as it should be. But here's the thing, and this is what distinguishes these moments from dropping the kid at daycare for the first time. Accompanying the pang of separation, which fades soaring joy at their wobbly but determined march up the steps of the bus. Look at them shrugging off their chrysalises and taking wing. Look at them with their backpacks scurrying down the sidewalk like hatchling sea turtles from nest to crashing wave. So I go on in that chapter to talk about the fact that I never actually developed a ritual for the yellow school bus moments. That my imagination fails me at times. That yes, there are traditional things I could do to mark happy occasions, but it's not really a happy occasion. And there are these times that we search and wish to create or find, and it's not there. And yet, the moment in its own way, we might describe as imminent, as sacred, as something possibly transcendent. So these little events may or may not yield a ritual that sometimes recurs in surprising ways. For me, those moments are often framed by old traditions and ideas, particularly from my Jewish background. Maybe it's my literary sensibilities or my personality, my tendency to see layers in experience, to spontaneously draw associations from here and there. I have no idea. These next section from chapter 7 illustrate some of that notion. This chapter is called Narrow Bridge. My first Thanksgiving in grad school in '83, I drove north from Philadelphia to Connecticut for the first time, navigating the terripitous of rush hour denizens and the skilla of Thanksgiving escapees. I was soon trying to keep pace on the life-threatening New Jersey Turnpike and the claustrophobia-inducing Garden State Parkway. And then a few miles past the Hudson, past the border into New York State, the sky opened and the Hudson spread to the horizons. The brown cliffs of the Palisades loomed, and the Tappan Zee rose, silvery and intricate. The bridge and I grew up together. 3 years before I was born, Chevy Bel Airs and Ford Country Squires began speeding over its new cantilever spans. The bridge was never meant to last more than 50 years because money and materials were tight after the Korean War. But in the second decade of the 21st century, new Priuses and Camrys hummed over this 3-mile stretch of the Hudson River. I go on to explain that my family would often cross that bridge to visit cousins in Baltimore, to visit the museums in D.C. Once I had my own children, we'd take the Tappan Zee on our way to holidays and vacations to avoid the George Washington Bridge's glacial pace. By the way, those of you out here in the Midwest may not appreciate what real traffic is in the northeast corridor of the United States. Just saying, okay? That's not in the book. One of the pleasures of crossing the bridge was to see what was visible in the distance. It was clear to the south, the silver-gray silhouette of the Chrysler Building, sometimes a glint of a window. If it was misty, a wash of skyline, maybe a spire poking through the clouds. You needed the perfect angle to get a full view of New York City, and even then it was a shooting star's worth of time in my peripheral vision. But the bridge was not without its shadows. The Wednesday of Thanksgiving week in 2001, the sign for the bridge filled me with dread. My son was a toddler, my younger child a baby. At the crown, I glanced south and saw nothing, just the gaping wound of sky where the Twin Towers had been. A private ritual took hold. Without a word, I'd regard the empty space above the city each time we crossed as though in pilgrimage. Even when the new fraternal Twin Towers emerged from the skyline, I still nodded to the old tower's ghosts, which hovered in the clouds. But there was grace from the sweep of the bridge. Sailboats leaned into the wind, barges plowed up the river. In severe winters, the Hudson could freeze in great chunks of ice that bumped against each other, waves lapping them along like in the Arctic. I say a bit more about my children and me crossing the bridge over time. I'm jumping ahead a bit. March 2016, I crossed the bridge sad and alone, driving south from my father's funeral. Not even the radio, just the silent shell of my car protecting me until I could scurry into the sanctuary of my house. On the first span heading south, a phrase from a Hebrew song popped to mind. Narrow bridge, from a saying attributed to the Hasidic Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. The whole world is a very narrow bridge, but the main thing to recall is not to be afraid. Though the Tappan Zee was wide enough, my life felt shrunken, so I performed the quick ritual of taking in the panorama, and right away I was on the downsweep to the other side of the Hudson, to New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and I coasted, the bridge carrying me with a fleeting sense of release and solace to the second half of the journey, away from my childhood town and my father's grave, toward home. Despite the, I'm going to call it, poignant optimism in what I've read so far, let's be clear about something that I said earlier in the talk. This book is not a rising crescendo of my triumphs in ritual life or in life in general. It is neither a self-help nor a how-to book. My imagination does fail me. My book is a memoir, blemishes and mishaps and all. I would like to read an excerpt that illustrates that imperfection and also a very important theme in this book, which is nature. This chapter is called The Heron. Returning from my summer vacation some years ago, I was greeted with an overripe flower arrangement on my doorstep, apparently delivered for my birthday a week before. The birthday itself was one of those whole numbers I would have preferred to forget at the time, as I also wanted to forget the ex-lover who'd sent the flowers. He, however, seemed to have forgotten I'd be away on my birthday, or that the romance was over. But no matter. I was about to trash the whole thing, but became morbidly fascinated with the stalks of lilies going limp, the carnations fading to a visceral pink, and the necks of daisies breaking on their own weight. Ferns shriveled, the petals of a mauve rose had begun to dry, a green florist sponge, punctured by the cut tips of stems, came off in crumbling chunks. The moldering composition was contained in a blood-red metallic glass urn and smelled like last month's memorial service. The thing was really blood-red. The arrangement sat on my bare dining room table, decomposing before my eyes. Natur mort. As the old masters would have understood, it was already dying the moment the florist created the arrangement. I enjoyed my sarcastic symbolism. I really should throw it out. I go on to talk about the following idea. I realized, though, that we were heading into a marker in the Jewish cycle of the seasons. The month of Elul, preceding the Jewish New Year, would begin in a few days. During Elul, some reflect on shortcomings and mistakes of the previous year and ask people for forgiveness, and we are supposed to forgive others. The next month, Tishrei signals the New Year. So I decided to perform a particular ritual that usually occurs on the second day of the Jewish New Year in the fall. The practice is called tashli, which means cast off. This practice occurs before the communal confession of sins and request for God's forgiveness on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. I always loved Tashlich, even though the concept of sin remained obscure. So I decided I was going to have my own form. Normally what you do is take breadcrumbs, or some people use lettuce nowadays, and you throw it into a moving body of water, symbolizing casting off of the sins. I would undertake a floral Tashlich, but do it for 7 days, like a period. I would take a little piece of the arrangement and walk down to the river near my house and throw a bit from across the bridge down into the moving body of water, watch it go away. So I did that over several days. I knew my plan might not yield forgiveness or anything, but I needed to do this. As I denuded the arrangement over the week, it was transmogrified into a kind of ikebana. If ikebana had been assembled by Edward Gorey. But one day, down the hill to the river, maybe the 4th day, the mist was rising, and in sight of the bridge, sun cast rays through the trees, glinting in the fractured morning light, perhaps 35 feet above, an enormous, perfectly round spider web spanned the path. And I talk about other natural sights I see. Sometimes I question the point of it. The week felt longer than 7 days, and some mornings I felt an old surge of resentment or sadness, wanted another 10 minutes of sleep, but I did it anyway. Ritual is like that. You repeat it and remain open to rare glimpses of transcendence or grace. So at the end of the week, I really kind of had it. It's hot, it's mosquito-y, it rained on me one day, a dog came running after me, and the joggers were getting in my way. I was like heartily sick of it, but I went anyway. When I reached the bridge, a thrilling sight met me. A great blue heron stood in the water upstream where I wasn't permitted by my own rules to look until I'd emptied my burden. I quickly dumped the remaining flowers into the water downstream, stuffed the plastic bag in my pocket, watched the flowers for a second, and turned to the other side of the bridge where the water rushed from its source. Although I'd seen herons flying in the area, I'd never seen one this close on this river. I couldn't help thinking this was it. This was why I did this, though maybe I didn't know it at the start. To note what's gone, but only briefly, and to leave the past in its murky doldrums and not check to see what happens to the remains, the memento mori of a dead relationship, and instead to be surprised, excited about the future, to look upstream to what is coming down the river toward where I stand on the bridge. The heron shot its head forward into the water and emerged with a large fish, shook it, raised its head, and gulped. I watched it feed and then take off with a haunting glide back up river. Talk a bit more about my intention and my experience at that time. So I read from 2 chapters that have bridges in them. The book is not chronological. It's not, I was born, I did all these rituals, I turned 40, I turned 50, etc. But there are themes that braid it all together. Leitmotifs, for those of you who know anything about music. Themes that recur. Nature, lots about my kids, and food. Look at the title, honey cake. And for those of you who are physically here, I have actually recipes for honey cake with my social on the back, of course. So many of us know that there were multiple religious and cultural traditions where food figures prominently, right? In ritual and both secular and religious. And as I developed this book, food kept coming up. I couldn't ignore it. And in fact, I have a chapter called Leavening about baking bread. And I'm not even a bread baker, but I heard enough stories from friends and family to know that I needed to talk about bread baking in this book. The last section I want to read to you, though, is from a different chapter about food, and it's called Sacred Pages. At the end of the teaching term one winter, a frenzy of grading, meetings, and frantic students sent my culinary habits into a nosedive. The fridge and freezer contained half a limb cabbage, frozen lumps that were probably ground turkey or beef, a handful of pathetic carrots, last week's desiccated rice, and containers of leftovers I was afraid to open. I peered at it all, hoping for something to gel for my Friday night dinner. A possibility emerged, a delectable, perfect, mouthfeel comfort food that isn't fussy. All I had to do was buy ginger snaps. I dug through a frayed manila folder containing dozens of torn, stained papers, some over 40 years old, and found a small pink telephone memo sheet, some of you don't even know what that is, from the days prior to voice and email. Scrawled in my hand was Grandma Rose's stuffed cabbage, along with notes from my maternal grandmother Belle and from someone named Nikki in Vermont, all variations on a theme of cabbage and ground meat cooked forever. So much information on this tiny paper, ingredients, instructions, and in some cryptic orthography along the edges, my mother's advice not to bother stuffing the cabbage, just make meatballs, roughly chop the cabbage, and throw it all in a pot. A tiny note at the bottom of the page stirred a memory. I'm standing in my shiny kitchen in a brand new ranch house in a brand new marriage in rural Pennsylvania, asking my grandmother over the phone what she thought of ground turkey instead of beef, and getting her advice about the cabbage breaking when you roll it. I could almost hear her ironic frown over the phone at the very notion of turkey. The note about the cabbage says, quote, boil it almost done first. But why keep these hastily copied recipes stuffed into the folder over the years? It would be easier to have them typed up and organized, since I do use some regularly, and the annotations would be easier to read. I keep the stained pink scrap of paper because it is sacred. I keep the folder of scraps because they are part of a ritual. So I go on to explain how I not only use those recipes periodically, but page through them sometimes, just looking at them, reading them over. Sifting through my file of recipes evokes swift streams of time, the flurry of boots and backpacks jumbled in the front hall, rafts of blocks and crayons, double helixes of carpools, cheerfully chaotic birthday parties, and the quick runs back and forth to the car for homemade Thanksgiving cranberry bread or Passover almond cake for holidays at the grandparents'. In addition to evoking memories, there's another reason for maintaining the ritual of paging through and sometimes cooking. Many of the cooks who gave me these recipes are gone, and the majority of them were women. These sacred pages are part of their legacy. The words are poetry, the product, artistry. So the stuffed cabbage recipe with the verbatim quote from Grandma is one of the few links to her and to my father's family. Murmuring her words and making her cabbage rolls is a sacred act. The rest of that chapter, I make an analogy to the discernment and the interpretation of sacred texts, of particular kinds of liturgy, of Talmud, one of the sacred books in Judaism. And I make the analogy of what is a pinch of that, or what is like a smush it up like this? What does that mean, okay? And I make this analogy and talk about not only the recreation of memory and the memorialization and keeping alive one's legacy, because that's part of what we do with ritual, but also the discernment and the interpretation of what has been handed to us. So on that note, I'm gonna hand my phone over to you, Sarah, for some pictures, and and I'm gonna take a sip of my tea and see if there are any questions. So, Sarah, anything you want to do here?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, any questions?
What made you want to write?
What made me want to motivate to write this book? Okay, so full confession, it started actually as a travel memoir. I write travel essays, and I'd written several, published some, had lots of notes for them, and I met with a dear colleague of mine from Penn State, where I used to teach, who's a fine writer and editor, and he said, oh yeah, he like took it out with me, we'll ride the wave of women's adventure, solo, travel writing, that genre is so popular, and look, we're doing this. So I go and I start reworking some of these essays, and I saw that there actually was another kind of journey taking place even in the travel essays. And that I looked back at my notes and other essays in progress and course notes and realized that for almost my whole career I had been contending with how we make meaning in whatever role, whether it was when I was being a psychologist or teaching in colleges or elsewhere. I'd always been working in this meaning making, and that ritual was part of that. So that those travel pieces, a couple of them, like the Tappan Zee one, was originally a travel essay and became something else. But as I did that, life went on, and I also found myself drawing from my notes, but also things that happened. So the pandemic, I didn't read any of the chapters. There were a couple chapters that I wrote during the pandemic about the transformation of ritual in our communities, and are looking for ways to find meaning even in those times. And as I said, life went on, and once I realized that's what I was doing, it just jumped out at me all over the place, both old notes and life presenting itself. And so it pulled it together that way.
How long did it take you to put from beginning to end?
I've been asked that question a few times, and it's really hard for me to say. I hesitated because some of these essays were started years ago, and some things never see the light of day. But from beginning, once I decided it was a book on ritual, and it was a memoir, and it was a collection of essays that was not going to be chronological, from that moment, I want to say it was about 2 years to start to write and rewrite, maybe a bit more, until the time I started to send it out for possible publication. And then the editorial process, of course. But some of the essays had pieces and bits, and think of it like a patchwork quilt that I was like digging through old scraps and found some that worked and some didn't. But strictly speaking, about 2.5 years. And a lifetime. If that's, yes.
Tell me about the title.
Yes, so Milkweed and Honey Cake, and I have to credit my absolutely amazing editor, Dan Chrisman, who was formerly at Indiana University Press, which is the parent press for Red Lightning, which is the trade arm of Indiana. Dan Chrisman helped me formulate the title. I wanted something that alluded to the nature theme in the book and the cultural / sort of religious, but I didn't want to confine it to religious. And so Milkweed, for some of you know that milkweed is a wildflower that grows in, I think, many regions of this country, if not most. And it supports the full life cycle of the monarch butterfly and is the So it's the host plant for the monarch, and it's also a nectar source for many other pollinators. And so I love that idea, the milkweed. And the honey cake is a sweet cake that Jewish people, at least from my tradition, from Eastern Europe, my ancestors were, make around the Jewish New Year. For those of you who like a little literary twist on it, and maybe I'll read the title a very particular way, Milkweed and Honey Cake. Okay, milk and honey, okay, so that's in there as well. I'll leave it at that. I don't need to belabor that. The subtitle, a memoir in ritual moments, rather than of. Because it's not circumscribed. It's these moments. I enter the moment and I leave it. And so it is a memoir through and in these ritual moments, rather than, these are all the ritual moments in my life, of ritual moments, if that makes sense. Yes.
So you've got the themes of nature and food in the very title and in your readings. And I would suppose that another theme is your children. What are some of the things that you relate with, of the abundance of things that
Yes.
are
Yes. So I have a few chapters that focus on the following themes explicitly, but others touch on them throughout. So again, I said leitmotifs, these recurrent themes. And one of them is a question about the boundaries around ritual, both what we mean by ritual. And I explicitly say in my intro that a salutary, however you pronounce it, habit to me is not a ritual. So running every morning may be healthy. For some people it may become a ritual, but it's the intention behind the ritual, the context, maybe some of the history. So I talk about sort of that boundary, that kind of boundary, the distinction, and I explore, and we can debate that. I mean, those are open questions. I said it's not a how-to, right? But the other part of that boundary question is boundaries around ritual communities. So I explore quite explicitly in some of the stories, where do we enter these other ritual communities? How much do we share? How much can we adapt, borrow, change from each other, and preserve the respect and the integrity of a ritual and the ritual community? And I struggle with that in a couple of the chapters, and uncomfortably so, okay? So one of those chapters I talk about being invited with my students and a colleague to a Native American, a tribal area, and being invited to participate in one of their rituals, and individually for me struggling with whether I wanted to do that and what I felt about that, and thinking about the history in this country and the concerns I had about cultural appropriation. And so that chapter explores that probably the most explicitly, raising more questions, I think, than answering. So the boundaries around ritual, both its definition and between and among ritual communities. Can we borrow? Where are there strict boundaries? I have my sense of those, but it's a changing one. And that's, to me, an interesting discussion, and I hope it raises that discussion for readers as we go forward.
All right, perfect.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thanks.
We'll just be right at the glass display, please, so
Okay.
get some autographs.
All right, so, thank you, that's always better than not. All right.
To the